They walked into the room like ghosts I never wanted to see again. Polished and practiced smiles, the kind worn by people who have perfected the art of apologizing to themselves. My parents. My chest tightened at the sight of them. Every old wound pulsed as if the past were trying to reassert itself. They called themselves my guardians. Guardians. It felt obscene in my mouth, a word so rich with pretension, it cracked. 15 years is a long time. 15 years is long enough for a child to become an adult, and an adult to learn how to bury the shapes of absence so deeply they appear at last as an outline on the wall, rather than an open bleeding wound. When I had first learned the language of abandonment, cold floors, unanswered questions, the silence that becomes as familiar as breathing, it was my aunt who taught me the alternative. She taught me that absence does not equal erasure. She taught me that you could be seen and made whole by someone who chooses to stay. I remembered the night I was found. Raw winter air. A torn backpack left like a curse on a stranger's doorstep. The bruise blooming beneath my sleeve. I can still feel the cotton of that sleeve against my skin. Smell the damp of old cardboard and fear. My parents had disappeared months earlier, chasing some promise they thought more important than their child. My aunt, who had once been a neighbor with a tidy little house and a job that paid decently enough to keep lights on, took me in without dramatic announcements. Her brand of compassion was quiet. Hot soup on the table, a hand on the back while I slept. A stack of overdue library books tucked beside my pillow. "You are not disposable," she'd whisper in the dark. And I'd say it back like a prayer until it stopped being a prayer and became fact. For 15 years she watched me grow. She scraped, saved, and invested not out of greed, but out of a deliberate frugality designed to build a safety net for the girl who would someday need one. She believed in me in calculations and in quiet gestures. Enrollment forms completed at midnight. A worn-out car fixed rather than replaced. Academic fairs attended with a fierce, solitary pride. She taught me to be industrious and honest, how to read contracts with a skeptical eye, how to measure a person's worth, not by the fullness of their pockets, but by how they showed up when visibility was low. When the cancer came, it felt like the world had tilted under my feet. Grief isn't dramatic in the way movies sell it. It's a long winter you don't get to leave. I watched her shrink and then harden against the disease, as if she were excavating every molecule of herself to leave something precise and unblurred behind for me. Her final months were practical and luminous. She made lists, not shopping lists, but lists of who she wanted to contact, what documents were crucial, where the deeds were hidden. She trained her lawyer with patient repetition. "Do not let them rewrite their story," she told me once, eyes fierce. "Make sure the truth is preserved." When she finally signed the will, she did it with the same exacting care she'd used to knit winter sweaters for me and to make sure my cap and gown weren't worn by someone else. I inherited everything. A modest house that smelled of lavender and old books, investments that would ensure stability, and the kind of legal paperwork that transformed stories into rights. The leftover sum, after expenses and taxes, was close to $2 million. Not currency of tenderness, but enough to make practical differences. College funds for my future children. A business venture if I chose. The ability to stop worrying about rent notices and car repairs. And somewhere in between the closing of her casket and the first breath I took without her in the house, the voicemail lit up. My phone played the voice of my mother after years of static silence, syrupy, contrite, and impossible to trust. "We heard about your aunt. We'd like to see you to talk. We were so young then. We made mistakes. A soft word for leaving a child alone on the doorstep. They sent flowers, expensive arrangements with little cards that read, "Sorry for your loss." They drafted half-hearted letters. They called on holidays as if their guilt was a seasonal custom. The neighbors saw them one day, well-dressed, with arms full of casseroles and champagne platters, a spectacle of white lies and carefully curated regret. People who had seen them leave found it newsworthy that they had returned. Whispers slid down cul-de-sacs and across apartment hallways. They were performing for the community as much as for us. When I told my lawyer that they had started circling, he merely raised an eyebrow in that calm way lawyers have. He left the legalities to the documents my aunt had prepared. Notarized statements, logbooks, bank records, witness testimony that traced a timeline of neglect so precise it shamed even on paper. "Don't react," he said. "Let them make the first move." I wanted to laugh at his insistence, because for a long time hiding my anger was how I'd survived. But I'd learned restraint. Restraint is power when you wield it like a scalpel. The day of the reading felt like a small court trial, staged in the mahogany heartbeat of my aunt's old law office. The room smelled of leather and dust and a certain old authority. The table, a slab of polished dark wood, was broad enough to host a conversation and precise enough to present evidence. I sat at the head of it, a place I'd occupied at my aunt's insistence since she had always liked the symbolism of it. The head of the table, the person who steers. My partner stayed near the doorway, hands in fists, our small son tucked in their arms playing with a plastic dinosaur. I noticed the way my son looked at me, a small open book of trust, and something in my chest cooled. Whatever spectacle unfolded that day, it must not be allowed to frighten him. My parents swept in like men and women at the end of a well-practiced scene. My mother wore red, the color of loud apologies, and a perfume that smelled of jasmine and intent. My father smiled, like a man who had once been capable of lying to himself until even his teeth believed the story. They greeted the lawyer with thin pleasantries, and then turned to me as if the years of absence could be made polite with a casual comment. "We're here for you," my father announced, placing a hand on the back of a chair. "Family stays together. You have a lot to manage now, child. You need guidance." Guardianship sometimes. Guardianship, my mother repeated, like one of those phrases they had learned at a seminar. I did not let them touch my hands. I let their fingers hang in the space between us, as if I were measuring the distance between truth and performance. My lawyer unfolded the last packet, the final clause of my aunt's will. He did it with a slight theatricality that would have made her smirk. The clause was meticulous. If any person related by blood or prior guardianship attempted to claim the estate without legitimate, documented proof of continuous care and contribution, and there was no evidence of such, then all documented evidence of neglect would be filed into public record and made available to any party inquiring about the matter. The consequences were clear. Bank records, missing child reports, witness statements from neighbors and school staff who had noticed a child's slow vanishing, all would be legal documents accessible to anyone. People who had once admired their image now saw it rip open like a cheap costume. My mother's hand trembled. My father's jaw locked as though his face were a mask and the hinges had rusted. They had come for money, to be forgiven for reasons that made no moral sense. They had no right to the documents neatly stacked between the lawyer's fingers. The lawyer read, again and again, the list they'd compiled, and the room listened. Someone asked if this was a threat. It wasn't, not to me. It was a shield. It was the sort of protection measured out in legal language that my aunt had loved. Precise, without melodrama, and immovable. "We just want another chance," my mother said later, in a voice unspooled so thin it might as well have been transparent. "We made mistakes." "We?" Her lips kebabbed on the retort, face folding like crepe paper. My father tugged her sleeve and shepherded her toward the door with a false composure. They left with their heads high but hollow. The last thing I saw as they pulled away was my father's reflection in the car window, a man who had become a stranger in his own mirror. The aftermath was not triumphal in the way films make it. There was no confetti, no celebratory horn. There was only a series of small, practical acts that sealed the victory with the same quiet intentionality my aunt had used to build it. I sipped coffee in the kitchen, while my son did his homework at the small table by the window. Dinosaur army lined up along the sill. The sunlight slanting through the blinds cut clean strips across the counter, turning dust motes into something that looked like gold. For a while I allowed myself the luxury of simply watching him, the way his concentration furrowed his brow, the soft hum he made when he solved a problem. I remembered my aunt's hand smoothing the hair from my forehead in exactly that way. People in the neighborhood called to offer condolences and congratulations at once, confused by how the two could coexist. "You did the right thing," an elderly woman said down the line, voice thick with the wrong sort of sentimentality. "You kept your dignity." Dignity. The word felt elastic in my mouth. I didn't feel particularly dignified. I felt like someone who had been given a second chance at a life that had never been guaranteed. Freedom, not dignity, felt more accurate. The estate didn't erase the past. It just gave practical steps toward a future in which my son's nightmares would not have to be explained by me in the soft, trimming voice of survival. We installed locks on the basement doors my aunt had never allowed us to use. We repainted the guest room with a color my aunt would have called brave, teal, bold enough to be honest. I enrolled my son in a neighborhood soccer league and bought a bicycle he could ride without fear of flat tires. I made a list of things to do in a ledger, the way my aunt always had, with a neat column for priorities. One day, a neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, whom my aunt had once helped with a tax form, dropped by. He lingered a little, watching the way my son ran circles in the yard and how my partner leaned from the doorway to call him in for dinner. "She built more than money," he said, nodding at the house. "She built a place where people can belong." That phrase, "a place where people can belong," sank in. It wasn't the money I had inherited. It was a template for care, an exacting ethic of presence that could be replicated. I thought of how my aunt had taught me to treat receipts like chronicles and empathy like a steady ledger entry. Then there were the more public ripples. Word reached certain corners of the local neighborhood gossip, and then into social media. The story, a child abandoned, saved by an aunt, then returning parents rejected at the will reading, was the kind of human interest piece that attracted sympathetic takes and harsher ones. Some strangers celebrated my decision. Others, darker in temperament, called it cold, vengeful, even cruel. I learned quickly to ignore commentary from people who had no knowledge of the private valleys we'd crossed. My parents tried a few more things. They called the house and asked to speak with my son, an act I could barely name. The idea of them trying to build a relationship with him felt like a crude afterthought. I told them through my lawyer that any contact would be considered harassment if unsolicited. They tried to send gifts through a neighbor, toys that smelled faintly of perfume. And the neighbor, a woman who had watched over my childhood like a distant aunt, returned the packages with a curt note. Not accepted. Humiliation had been a part of the plan. I admit, not humiliation for cruelty's sake, but a dismantling of the image they hoped to reclaim. I wanted them to be met with the facts of their own absence, the witnesses who had seen and documented it. I wanted to pull back the curtain and show the world the choices they had made. But even as I set this into motion, a quiet part of me, the child who had once clung to a sleeve and hoped, still wondered if there remained room for reconciliation. The answer came slowly, in small private ways that didn't fit any of the frames I'd held in my hands. Night after night, as my son slept, my partner and I would talk quietly in the kitchen. "Do you ever regret it?" they asked once, eyes tired, hands folded around a mug. Regret. The word wrong-footed me. I had been angry, yes. Angry at their absence, at the years I had patched together from aunts and charity, at the cheap lessons they had taught my heart. But when I tried to imagine replacing the choice I had made, safeguarding my son, protecting him from repeated hurt, holding to a standard set by my aunt, I found I could not. I had not acted out of spite. I had acted out of a determination to build the kind of safety net that I myself had been given. After some months, the inevitable paper trail had its practical effect. A closed chapter. My parents, faced with the public documentation of their neglect, found their reputations diminished in the same social spheres where they'd once traded on charm. Some friends who had benefited from their social maneuvering drifted away. They lost the illusion of easy access to other people's pity. They began to sell expensive things with a desperation that smelled of defeat. A car, a piece of furniture, each transaction small and final. One afternoon, months after the will reading, I bumped into my father at the grocery store. He looked older than the last memory I kept of him. He hesitated in the cereal aisle as if the boxes were foreign geography. Our eyes met. For a moment, a child I once was flickered between us. standing in the doorway of a house with a torn backpack. He said nothing at first. Then awkwardly he asked, "How is he?" He meant my son. My partner, carrying the shopping basket, watched me carefully. I could have turned away. I could have walked off with the same coldness I had shown the day of the will reading. Instead, I answered, "He's good. He's learning to ride a bike. He likes dinosaur figures. He wants to be an astronaut." My father's face didn't change. The information landed like pebbles against a window. "I'm sorry," he murmured, and the words were real in a way that surprised me. I did not run to forgive. Forgiveness is not an instinct. It is a deliberate choice and one that could not be made on the spot. I told him simply, "We all have to live with our choices." That night, for the first time, the child in me, the one who had once catalogued small mercies like breath, allowed a strange tenderness to rise. Not for them, necessarily, but for the arc they'd made which had led them here, a place of small apologies and diminished means. I thought of how the world is messy, how people sometimes find their shame in the light, and oddly, keep going. Time has a way of rearranging a life in the smallest of increments. My son grew taller and louder. He learned how to read long words and to apologize when he knocked over another kid playing blocks. My partner's laughter returned in the living room like music restarting after a pause. I started a small foundation in my aunt's name, a modest scholarship for kids who had been through the foster system or whose family situations were fractured but salvageable. The foundation wasn't a monument to vengeance. It was an extension of the ethic my aunt had practiced. Presence, quiet aid, a refusal to let a child be disposable. There were occasional moments of ugly news, calls from lawyers who wanted to reopen issues, texts from people who invented stories to sell papers. But these died quickly, smothered by the more regular daily work of living, school concerts, dentist appointments, grocery lists. As the years thickened, I found my anger unwound in unexpected places. I watched my son comfort a friend after a scraped knee and felt an unfamiliar pride that felt like mine. I taught him to balance a checkbook when he was old enough, to understand the difference between want and need, to write thank you notes that weren't perfunctory. He grew into someone hard to embarrass. He became someone who could own a mistake and move past it without shrinking. When my parents reached out again, years later, their tone softer, almost humble, I answered in a different register. I sent a brief note through the lawyer asking them to donate any contact they wished to wish for in a public forum, to write a letter articulating their responsibility and willingness to take part in family counseling and child care courses, to make overtures that would require concrete proof of rehabilitation. There was no romantic return to a picture-perfect family. There was instead a ledger, tasks completed, certificates issued, therapy attendance verified. If they wanted to be in our lives in a way that would not harm my son, they had to work for it. They did not, in the end, complete the ledger. Life had taught them different lessons. Many things are easier to sell than to learn. In the quiet that followed, I did not feel triumphant so much as steady. I had navigated trauma into an architecture that protected the person I had chosen to raise and the child I loved. Some people described what I had done as unforgiving. Others saw it as survival. The truth lives somewhere quieter. It was the result of decades of small decisions. The way my aunt wrote down witnesses' accounts, the way she made me read contracts, the way she taught me that names on a paper could translate into real, enforceable care. The will had been a tool. The real inheritance was a model of responsibility. On the night of my mother's last call, years after I'd taken possession of the house, and after my son had long since stopped needing a nightlight, I found myself on the porch with a cup of tea. The house felt alive with small noises. The furnace's hiss, the refrigerator's soft lilt, the distant bark of a dog. My phone rang. It was her. She left a message in a voice that had grown thin and sincere. I know I can't ask for what I took, and I can't give back the years. I only wanted to tell you I'm sorry. The message ended. The moon hung over the yard like a copper coin. I listened to my son's even breath through the floorboards and then to my own heartbeat, measured in the quiet between thoughts. Forgiveness is not a single event. If it is to occur, it will be a slow thing, teased out in those ordinary acts that either mend or break a life. I could not give it all at once. But standing there, cup warming my palms, I was not the same frightened child abandoned on a doorstep. I was someone who had learned how to convert hurt into protection, how to make a ledger out of love. I turned the phone off and put it in the drawer. For a long time afterward, I thought about the difference between the people who leave and the people who stay. Both are human, both are fallible, but presence is the rudest, most radical act of love I have ever known. When my son grew into his own life, messy and imperfect as it should be, he would have his own list of choices to make. I hoped I had taught him the right ones, to be present when it matters, to measure his words and his promises, and to understand that love without accountability is just a pretty word. In the end, the inheritance was not merely the house or the investments. It was the architecture my aunt left behind, an insistence that people be seen, the mechanisms to keep them safe, and the freedom to refuse toxic cycles. I kept the house. I kept the rule book she'd written in careful handwriting. I kept, most importantly, a ledger of quiet deeds and a small scholarship that would, in time, send other children into futures that were not defined by the absence of their parents. When strangers asked what victory felt like, I would tell them this: victory is small and domestic. It is the sound of a child laughing as he learns to ride, the way a partner will fold you into a quiet evening, the ledger you keep of kindnesses done in your aunt's name. Victory is not the humiliation of others. If anything, it is the restoration of peace. They came back like ghosts I did not invite. They left in the end, as people who had to live with what they'd done, as human beings with smaller rooms and quieter reputations. I, for my part, kept walking forward with my son's hand in mine, the past catalogued, but not able to harm us again. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is very quiet, I tell him the story of the woman who found me on a doorstep and told me I was not disposable. I tell him about the way she taught me to count money, weigh contracts, and keep receipts like prayers. He listens with wide eyes and then goes back to sleep, confident that someone somewhere had once chosen to stay. That was the inheritance my aunt left, a blueprint for care that outlived even death, and a life rebuilt in the shadow of her quiet insistence. It was everything to me.